he's a graduate of the School of Foreign Service 1986. And then has gone on to do doctoral work at Harvard and has had really strikingly good career at Amherst. We'll see if anyone manages to poach him from Amherst over the next couple of years. But part of the reason for that, I think, is the sheer volume and quality of his work. He's really one of the strongest of the Latin Americanists. In the United States, his range is impressive. He's written books about Honduras and Guatemala, Argentina, gay rights in Latin America, Venezuela, and I'm leaving out 2 or 3 others. So it's really a pleasure to have him here, and particularly to speak on the very complex situation that is underway in Venezuela. So, Javier, thanks for taking the time. I know that you're busy, and especially at the end of the day that he's had a full day. So we're deeply appreciative. He'll speak for about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then we'll just have a conversation, at which point I will probably ask you if you have questions to identify yourself, just so that he is not at a disadvantage in addressing the question. So thank you very much, Javier.
My pleasure to be here, Sergio. Yes, it is homecoming. I love coming back to Georgetown, and it has changed so much, but so much of it is still has the same feel, especially on a spring day like today. I know I spent a lot of my spring semester senior year sitting on that same lawn, so it was nice to see that the tradition continues. And thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming to talk about this topic. And since it's a small group, which is perfect and it's great, I hope that we can get through my slides quickly so that we can actually get to the point where there is a conversation about what is going on. I think that studying Venezuela is really exciting because, from a political science point of view, because there was somebody at some point who said, you know, you never know whether what you're seeing in Venezuela is a ghost from Latin American past moving into our present day, or is this the future of Latin America? And so who knows? But so let me start. And what I want to do is basically, how did Venezuela get into this mess? Economic and political mess. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time doing some of the economics, and then we can do a little bit of the politics. And the title is based on an article I wrote, Más Duro Maduro, which is a play on word on harder Maduro. Sort of like, why are we seeing a much more authoritarian regime after Chavez under Maduro? And the first thing I want to say is I do not think that this is the product of different leadership. In other words, I think there were structural forces going in this direction, and the argument is going to be that under Chavez, you established a competitive authoritarian regime, and we can talk about it. There are people who like that term, others dislike it. But as the regime has become less competitive, by competitive we mean that it is able to win in elections. As it has become less competitive, an authoritarian regime must either democratize or it has to turn more authoritarian. And they have moved in the direction of authoritarianism, not because it is deterministic, but simply because they have a lot of institutional capacity to turn somewhat authoritarian. Up until February in 2014, when the protests began, and for the first time in Venezuela, the path toward authoritarianism hit the most significant bump. So let's go through this process and then also discuss the economics of it. You know, here's a little bit of what has happened to Chavismo. It's not easy to see, but you can see the high point of Chavez's popularity in the election of 2000, reaching levels of 70%. It went down, but he always remained at the level of 55, sometimes 60, and it was a very comfortable situation. There was a little bit of a problem in 2010, but he recovered, which was remarkable. And then he died, and since then, Maduro's popularity has come down. But you know, during most of Chavez's administration, this was the competitive regime that, given an election, they could win. And yes, there were irregularities, and yes, there was a lot of fraud. The margin of victory was always comfortable enough, was higher than the margin of irregularities, and so there is where the regime got its legitimacy. So now, it is in this mess, and I want to borrow a little bit from resource curse theory to help us. I'm gonna be a little bit analytical, theoretical, only to give us some help. And I'm going to talk about the resource curse argument in a way that is not publishable. It's very, very, very mundane and simplistic, perhaps, but I think it's nevertheless helpful. In development studies, there has been a boom in the topic of what is the impact of relying too much on one commodity. And whereas we used to think that this was always good, now we think it's a curse. And it's a hypothesis, and the curse is that if you have an enormous reliance on one commodity, it can ruin your economy. And I don't want to talk too much about it directly, but it can also ruin your politics. So let me try to summarize what might happen if you are a petrostate like Venezuela under some of these arguments. So you have an oil boom, as Venezuela did since 2003, and as many countries did with other commodities. Let's suppose that you're a democracy. Let's assume you're a democracy. Well, one side tells you this can help democracy because it allows you to spend. And democracy is expensive, the provision of rights is expensive, and there are inequities that need to be solved, and so the boom helps you with democracy, hence the plus sign. But it encourages clientelism and cronyism, and so through that mechanism, democracies can deteriorate. So this is a debate as to what is going to happen to democracy under an oil boom. All right, so let's leave that aside and let's see what happens when, oops, I just turned this off. Oh, oops, got scared. What happens when you have an authoritarian regime? Well, there is a plus and a negative sign, a negative expectation. The negative expectation is that an authoritarian regime will be able to spend on the military and crack down, and it's also going to be able to co-opt. In other words, use the spending for the ability to buy key support from several actors. So this means that an oil boom will bolster autocracy, will allow the autocracy to continue to play its game. On the other hand, under an autocracy, you will see the rise of modernized sectors. The boom will create a new set. If you look at your modernization theory, you can pretty much begin to talk about new middle classes, more independent actors, new social actors that weren't there before that may not necessarily be that co-optable. So it's not automatic that an oil boom is negative for democracy under an autocracy. So what I think happens under Venezuela, and this is sort of like the analytical proposition, and then we'll get to the empirics, is that many of us, not just me, but many of us have argued that Chavez created a hybrid regime when there are elements of democracy and elements of autocracy. The autocracy is very visible in dealing with the opposition and in dealing with checks and balances. Complete disregard of checks and balances and mistreatment of the opposition. A nice word for it would be sectarianism. So that is the autocratic part, but there were elections. And the elections produced a competitive side. So in many ways, the Chavez regime gives you the full array. All those pluses and minuses are visible in Venezuela under Chavez. And in many ways, when there was a lot of money, the modernized sectors were emerging, sort of like the new middle classes that were completely devastated in the 80s and 90s, and they have come back now. But he has also definitely inflated a clientelistic network that didn't exist before. It existed under the previous oil boom, as well as the military side. And this is what Chavez leaves behind, but the oil boom is now in trouble. Not because the price of oil has dropped, but because the management of the oil in Venezuela is in such trouble that the revenues that the Venezuelan government is able to generate from its oil exports is at an all-time low. We can talk about why that is, but it has produced a dollar crisis. It's not as severe of a balance of payment crisis as you would have in Greece or in a country undergoing structural adjustment, but you have, for the first time since 2003, Chavez didn't really get to see this, they have run out of dollars. They have very few dollars. They have enough. Why don't we show you some? Here's a chart showing how much of an oil state Venezuela is. Venezuela now has proven reserves of about 211 billion barrels of oil, which is more than Saudi Arabia. This is the price of oil. Historically, you can see Chavez comes in 2003, and you can see what a nice moment he enjoyed when he came in. This is how much money he generated. This is the total sum of the windfall. Here is, this is from Francisco Monaldi. Here you see the size of the oil boom from 2003 to 2012. No Latin American country has had this gift from heaven, because it cannot be called anything else. This is extraordinary for Venezuela, but for Latin America. Let me skip this because it's not that important, but here's the problem, the oil problem that Venezuela has. This is a chart that compares Brazil to Venezuela from 1990 to 2010. The vertical bars are the levels of reserves. And as you can see, both Brazil and Venezuela have had increasing benefits from geology. More reserves have been discovered. And then the red line, I think it is red, I'm colorblind, but I think it's red, shows domestic production. In Brazil, it keeps going up, and in Venezuela, it is going chronically down under Chavez. This is, ladies and gentlemen, Chavez's legacy on the oil industry. You would think that the most important milk cow in the regime would be treated like a sacred cow, but no. It has been very mismanaged, and this is one reason why Venezuela is unable to generate the dollars. So the oil company incurs huge debts, which is, again, unimaginable given the oil boom. But investments aren't necessarily going up. Part of this is going into good social spending. Part of it is going into clientelistic spending, corruption, militarism, cooptation, so all the other aspects. And so it's not necessarily going into the investments in the oil company. It's not necessarily going into exclusively social spending. A lot of it is being spent in other ways of building the authoritarian regime. Now, take a look at the level of reserves. This is